Perhaps the biggest con and maybe pro for Propolis from Flatout Games comes in the very first 2 sentences of the rulebook, which I'll read for you right now. Propolis is a worker placement, engine building, area control, and tableau building game for 1 to 4 players. Players take on the role of competing medieval bee colonies and take turns deploying worker bees to collect pollen, fortifying their positions, and constructing their hives to appease their queen to become the most glorious in the land. In Propolis, players have a stash of bees and a board to track their resources. On their turn, they'll take 1 of 5 actions and continue to do so until 1 player has built 10 structures. Those 5 actions could be 1. Deploy worker beeples. Traditional worker placement games would have you placing only 1 worker bee per turn. However, Propolis does away with such archaic thought, allowing you to move as many as you'd like, up to the amount of empty spaces there are to any single unoccupied card, gaining resources matching each space taken. 2. Fortify worker beeples. Turn as many of your commissioned bees on their side. This makes them worth 2 bees, which I'll get to in just a minute. 3. Retreat worker beeples. Remove any number of worker beeples you currently have deployed, fortified or not, to your personal supply. 4. Construct a structure. This is the meat and potatoes of the game. On your turn, you can spend those delicious resources you've been saving to build a card from the market and place it in your tableau. These cards could offer you permanent resources, endgame points, and extra workers. 5. Construct a Queen's Palace card. This is just like the last option, except you build 1 of the special Queen structure cards laid out at the start of the game, and you can only use permanent resources to construct them. Each player may only build 1 of these types of buildings. The cards used in the game are double-sided. One side has spaces for beeples to fly to, the other has a structure. Throughout the game, as the market supply is used and conflicts happen, the landscape fluctuates. The market landscape is familiar. Once a card is purchased and built, then it is replaced at the end of the turn. However, those worker placement space cards are a little bit different. In the instance that there are no remaining completely empty landscape cards in one of the rows, at the end of a turn, you check for the majority. Remember fortifying bees, putting them on their side, that's where this comes in. Take the row, count the bees. The most bees wins the conflict. Kind of. The player with the majority gets all of their bees back to their supply. Then the first empty card furthest to the right is discarded, the row is slid down, and a new card is placed. Now, if you won that majority conflict and it was not your turn when it happened, you then gain a single wild resource, which is pretty cool. Once a player has built 10 structures, including their starting structure and potentially a Queen's Palace structure, the end game is triggered. And once everyone has had an equal number of turns, you count up the points based on structures, guild sets, and excess resources. In a recent review of one of Weird Giraffe's games, I mentioned something that I think is familiar here, in that these small, passionate design groups, board game design groups, have they can be very deceptive. And what I mean by that is not necessarily a bad thing. They take something that is so cute looking and innocent looking, and it is far more complex than it appears. Now, that's not to say that this is necessarily a difficult game, but we are in a landscape where there is a gluttony, a complete rush of fairly good, easy entry mass market games, or not even mass market games, games like Flip 7, where you can get that game to the table and explain it in a matter of seconds. Propolis is not that, despite the fact that it kind of looks like it is. But again, that's not a bad thing necessarily, but it may be a con. Because I have to recognize the fact that if I want to play this game, and this is, personally, I'm in a landscape where I don't get out and get to play a lot of games in public gatherings. And so a lot of times, if I'm at a family gathering, that's where I'm going to be playing casually some of these board games that I bring. Propolis, if I specifically, I read those first 2 sentences again to a coworker just to get their reaction, and they glazed over. And that's nothing against them. It is the expectation that when I'm talking about a board game in a work setting, especially to someone that's not necessarily in the hobby, they don't expect it to be a long-winded thing. And not that that really was that big of a deal, but those 2 sentences were enough to have someone's eyes glaze over. And so picking and choosing which audience you play Propolis with is important. And that may be just you. And it's got a solo mode. So that's a-okay for me. That being said, this is something I've praised Flatout Games for in the past. They do a great job of making games that are far less complex in practice than they are in theory. Meaning that, while the game itself takes a bit of legwork to explain, especially with how it looks on the surface, Propolis thrives at being a strategically rich game with fairly simplistic turns, fairly simplistic options. You get to do one thing on your turn and one thing only. And that right there is what makes Flatout games so good for me. Strategically rich games with simple choices to make each turn. And that's the selling point, because once you get up and running, once you get through setting up all the cards and all the different tokens and everything, and you take just that first turn, if you can get someone to take that first turn, that's where they're going to see the sheen on this and really appreciate what you've got. The idea that the theme itself feels paced on is non-existent here. And that's something that a lot of worker placement games are guilty of. However, Propolis, the fact that you have a bunch of bees and you can place or remove as many worker bees as you want, as you have, as you're legally capable of doing, changes the whole feel of the worker placement genre, in that you've got swarms of bees going on the board and being removed from the board, and you've got bees that are in conflict and more bees coming off the board. The rounds are not dictated by the pool of workers. The rounds are dictated by the placement of workers, meaning you kind of keep going and you keep taking what you need, you move away, you keep taking what you need, you move away. And it feels like there's swarms of bees getting on the board, removing themselves from the board. It's like they're going into flowers and out of flowers and back to the hive and back and forth. All the while you're building up your own hive, constructing cards until you've got the perfect beehive. There's variable scoring, and all of it melds really, really well together. I feel like I went a little heavy on the cons on this one, which isn't fair. I'm trying to be accurate in what I'm saying in terms of the cons for this game, because I enjoyed this game. I like this game quite a bit. I like the way it looks. I like the way it plays. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It is a good game. It is a game that I would recommend. However, the cons that I did mention are something to take into consideration. Now, if you're a fan of Flatout games, you know what to expect. They make games that succeed, and this is one that deserves to succeed. Take my con in mind and take it with the grain of salt of what you're expecting from this. Because when I say that these design groups are deceptive, what I mean is not that they are purposely trying to deceive you. It is that they are so passionate and they craft these games so finely that occasionally I feel like some of these rule books get lost in the woods and aren't reaching a massive audience. And that's not a bad thing, because games that are made specifically for mass market purposes are not what these are intended to be, despite the fact that they sometimes look like them. I don't know, I'm saying an awful lot, but all I mean to say is that Propolis sounds far more complex than it is in theory, and regardless of all of that, it is a ton of fun to play, so check it out. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, all that good stuff. You can find me on most forms of social media at Plumpy Thimble. Thank you so much.